I never told my son about the money. Not the full picture, anyway. He knew I'd worked for 32 years as a senior actuary at Sun Life Financial, but I let him assume I'd retired with a modest pension and some modest savings. The kind of retirement that requires careful budgeting, sensible grocery shopping, and maybe the occasional worry about the furnace giving out in February. He assumed, and I never corrected him. I didn't plan it that way. It just became easier, over time, to let people see what they expected to see. My name isn't important to this story. What matters is that I'm 68 years old. I live, or I did live, in a 3-bedroom house in Oakville, Ontario, and for the last 14 months, that house had 3 more people in it than I'd ever intended. My son Owen moved back in the October before last, after his company downsized and let half the marketing department go in a single Friday afternoon. He called me from the parking lot, voice tight the way it gets when he's trying not to sound frightened. I told him to come home. I told him to bring Krista and the boys. I had the space, I had the room. That was true. What I didn't say, what I chose not to say, was that the space and the room came attached to a house I owned outright, with no mortgage, paid off 11 years ago, or that my pension was supplemented by investment income that put my monthly take-home well above what most people earn in a year. I didn't say any of that. I just said, come home. I have room. Krista had always been polite to me in the way that people are polite to someone they find mildly inconvenient. Pleasant enough at Christmas, remembering my birthday with a text message, asking after my health in the tone of someone completing a checklist. I didn't take it personally. She was busy. They were busy. I understood that my son had built a life that moved at a different speed than mine, and I'd made my peace with it years ago, after Owen's father passed. But living together is a different thing than visiting. Living together reveals things. Within the first 2 weeks, I noticed that Krista had rearranged the kitchen without asking. The cast iron pan my late husband had bought at a market in Stratford 30 years ago was moved to the back of a cupboard. The good tea towels, Irish linen, a gift from my sister before she moved to Victoria, were used to wipe down the stovetop. Small things. I told myself they were small things. Owen left for work each morning before 7, commuting into Toronto for a consulting contract he'd picked up by November. I was glad for him. He's good at what he does, and watching him rebuild his confidence that autumn was genuinely one of the better things I've witnessed. He'd come home some evenings almost cheerful, talking about a campaign he was developing, asking me what I thought about things the way he used to when he was young. Krista, meanwhile, was working from home in my office, which became her office, which came equipped, I noticed, with a new ergonomic chair she'd ordered without mentioning it. The invoice came to the house. I left it on the kitchen counter. She moved it to the recycling. I didn't say anything. I told myself it was fine. Families adjust. This was temporary. Then February came, and with it the conversation that changed everything. It was a Tuesday evening. Owen was still at the office. The boys were upstairs doing whatever 7- and 9-year-olds do on school nights, and I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of red rose tea, reading. Krista came in and opened the fridge and stood there for a long moment, and I had the feeling, the particular, specific feeling, of being about to receive news I hadn't asked for. She turned around and leaned against the counter and looked at me in a way that was almost kind. Almost. The kind that has already decided something. I've been wanting to talk to you, she said, about some things. I put my book down. I waited. Owen and I have been talking, and we've been thinking about the long term, about what makes sense practically. She paused. This house is big, obviously, but it's also getting a bit much for one person, especially at your age. And we were looking at some options, and there's actually a really lovely seniors community in Burlington. Independent living. Very nice. Collingwood Terrace, it's called. They have activities and a dining room, and Owen could visit on weekends. I looked at her. You'd have your own space, she continued. your own routine. And honestly, you'd probably be happier with people your own age around, people who are at the same stage of life. I said, "Are you asking me to move out of my house?" She did something with her expression, a small rearrangement that was meant to look like patience. "I'm saying we should think about what's realistic. Owen isn't going to say this because he finds it hard. But practically speaking, with the boys getting older and us needing more room to work, it makes more sense for the house to be used by a full family. You'd be much more comfortable at a place like Collingwood." I thought about several things in that moment. I thought about the mortgage I'd paid off in 2014 after years of overpayments. I thought about the name on the title, which was mine and had been mine since 1989. I thought about the cast iron pan in the back of the cupboard and the recycled invoice and the linen tea towels. I said, "I'll think about it." She nodded as though that was the correct answer, as though the matter was essentially settled, and went back to whatever she'd been doing. I sat at the table for another hour. The tea went cold. I did not sleep well that night. What I did the next morning was call my financial advisor. Her name is Deborah, and she has worked with me for 19 years, and she is the kind of person who can deliver complicated information in a completely level tone of voice. I told her what had happened. I asked her to walk me through my full picture, everything. The investments, the property, the trust account I'd set up for the boys' education, the rental property in Hamilton I purchased in 2018, and said nothing about to anyone. I already knew the numbers. I'd always known the numbers, but hearing them laid out like that, in sequence, had a clarifying effect. Then I called my lawyer. His name is Arthur, and I've known him since our children were in the same swimming class at the Oakville YMCA. I asked him to look at something for me. He looked at it and called me back within 20 minutes. What I had always had, and what Krista had not thought to verify, was a property held entirely in my name, with no co-ownership, no co-signing, and no legal standing for anyone to suggest what ought to be done with it. What I also had, Arthur informed me gently, was every right to establish what arrangements I wanted to make with the people currently living in it. I thanked him and went for a walk. It was February in Oakville, which means your breath comes out in clouds, and the lake looks like pewter, and the cold has a specific kind of honesty to it. I walked for 45 minutes. I made some decisions. That evening, Owen came home at his usual time. He kissed me on the cheek and asked what was for dinner. We ate together, all 5 of us, and the boys told me about a project they were doing on the provinces, and I helped the older one remember that Prince Edward Island was the smallest by area, but not by everything, and it was a perfectly ordinary evening. After the boys were in bed, I asked Owen to sit with me in the living room. Krista started to follow, and I said, "Would you mind giving us a few minutes? Just the 2 of us." Something shifted in her face. Owen looked between us. I told him. I didn't tell him in anger. I didn't tell him in the cold, deliberate way of someone who has been rehearsing a scene. I told him the way I would tell him anything true, quietly, with the facts in order. I told him that Krista had suggested I move to a seniors facility in Burlington, and that she had presented this as a practical arrangement that would be better for everyone. I told him I found this surprising, given that the house in question belonged to me and had since before he was born. I told him about Deborah and the full financial picture. Not everything, but enough. The rental income in Hamilton. The investment accounts. The fact that I had, by conservative estimate, more financial security than anyone in this household had assumed. Owen went very still. He said, "She didn't." I said, "She did." He said, "I didn't know she was going to say that. I want you to know that." I believed him. Owen has never been good at concealing things he knows are wrong. It's one of the things I have always loved about him. That particular inability to be smoothly dishonest. He said, "Mom, I'm sorry." I said, "I know." We sat there for a moment. Outside, the February wind was doing something complicated with the bare maple in the front yard. I could hear it from where I sat. I said, I want to talk about what happens next, not in anger, just clearly. He nodded. I told them I wasn't asking them to leave immediately. I wasn't interested in punishment as a strategy, but I wanted several things and I wanted to say them plainly. I wanted my office back by the end of the month. I wanted the house to be treated as my home, because it was my home, and not as a transitional space belonging to whoever happened to need it most at the moment. And I wanted an honest conversation about a timeline, because I thought it was fair to everyone, including the boys, to have one. Owen said, "That's fair." Then the door opened. Krista had been standing in the hallway. I don't know for how long. Her face had the particular blankness of someone recalibrating very quickly. She said, "I didn't realize." I said gently, "I know you didn't." There was a long silence, the kind that fills a room. She said, "I thought, Owen said you were on a fixed income. I thought." "He didn't know the full picture either," I said. "I kept it private. That was my choice. But I think it's time we all had a clear understanding of where things stand." Krista sat down in the armchair across from us. She looked for the first time since I'd known her genuinely uncertain. I said, "I'm not telling you this to make you feel badly. I'm telling you because I think families work better when people know what's actually true." I gave them both time to say whatever they needed to say. Owen apologized twice more, which wasn't necessary, but which I understood. Krista said very little. She had the look of someone running internal calculations, and I recognized it, because I have spent 32 years running them myself. What happened over the following weeks was not dramatic. There was no explosion, no scene, no moment of cinematic confrontation. What happened was quieter and, I think, more real. Krista moved her equipment out of my office on a Sunday afternoon. She did it without being reminded. Owen reinstated my kitchen as a shared space that was treated with the consideration one affords someone else's kitchen. The boys, who understood none of the adult weather that had been passing through the house, continued to be loud and funny and occasionally infuriating in the way that 7- and 9-year-olds simply are. In March, Owen found a position with a firm in Mississauga, senior role. Better than what he'd had before. As it turned out, the layoff had rattled him, but it had also pushed him somewhere he'd been reluctant to push himself. He and Krista began looking at condos in Port Credit. They found one in April. They put in an offer. The night they told me, we were all sitting at the kitchen table, and the boys were drawing something elaborate on the back of an old envelope, and Owen said they'd found a place and they were hoping to be in by June. He said it carefully, watching my face. I said, "I think that's wonderful." And I meant it. I did mean it. There is a particular freedom in your children having their own roof over their heads, a freedom that goes both ways, and that I had almost forgotten about during those 14 months. Before they moved, Krista asked to speak with me alone. This surprised me slightly. We sat in the kitchen on a Saturday morning, the boys outside with the neighbor's dog, Owen, at the hardware store for something to do with the move. She said, "I want to apologize for what I said in February. I was thinking about logistics, about what would be easier, and I didn't think about how it must have felt to hear that, in your own home." I looked at her for a moment. She said, "I've been ashamed of it. I want you to know that." I said, "I appreciate you saying that." She said, "I think I assumed things about you that weren't fair, about what your life looked like, what you needed." She paused. "I think I was wrong about a lot of it." I said, "You were wrong about some of it, but you're not the first person to see an older woman living alone and fill in the rest of the picture themselves. It's a very human thing to do." She nodded. There was something in her expression that was difficult to name. Not quite relief, not quite sadness, something in between. I said, "Krista, my son loves you. My grandsons are wonderful. I would like us to have the kind of relationship where you feel you can call me or visit without it being complicated. That's what I want." She said, "I'd like that too. I don't know if it will be simple from here. Families aren't simple." But the afternoon they finally moved. The minivan packed, the boys arguing over who got to hold the succulent that had been living on my windowsill since before they were born. Owen hugging me for longer than usual at the front door. I felt something settle in the house that I recognized as my own quiet. I made tea. I put on the radio. I sat in the kitchen with the late June light coming through the window the way it does in Ontario when the days are finally long again. And I thought about what Deborah had said when I called her in February, after the conversation with Arthur, after my walk along the lake. She'd said, "You've always known exactly what you have. You just decided to be thoughtful about when you used it." That seemed right to me. It still does. I have a coffee with Krista now, once a month or so. We meet at a bakery in Port Credit near their building. She asks about my garden. She started asking real questions, not the checklist kind. I tell her about the raised beds I'm putting in this summer, and about the book club I joined at the library, and she listens in a way she didn't used to. Last month she texted me a photo of the older boy holding a report card with a big grin on his face. Just the photo, nothing written. That was enough. That was more than enough. And sometimes, when I'm in the kitchen in the early morning, before it's fully light, before the neighbors are up, before the day has asked anything of anyone, I set the cast iron pan on the burner, and I think about what it means to stay somewhere long enough to know what you have. It means everything. It has always meant everything. I've thought a lot about that February evening, the way Krista leaned against the counter and spoke to me with that almost kind expression, the kind that had already made its decision before the conversation began. I've thought about what I felt sitting there, the tea going cold, and I think what I felt, underneath everything, was clarity. Not anger, clarity. There's something that happens when you've lived long enough and worked hard enough and paid enough attention. You stop being surprised by the way people fill in the blanks about you. Krista looked at me and saw an elderly woman living alone in a large house, and she drew her conclusions the way anyone might. I don't entirely blame her for that. What I couldn't accept was the certainty of it, the way she presented her assumptions as facts, as logistics, as something that was simply being managed. I think about what it took to respond the way I did. Not to stand up and say everything I knew, right then in that kitchen, not to make her feel small the way her words had made me feel. It took something I'd spent decades building quietly inside myself, a kind of steadiness that isn't the same as patience exactly. It's more like knowing that the right moment will come if you don't waste yourself on the wrong one. Owen didn't know. That matters to me. He had his own assumptions about my finances, built from things I'd let slide rather than corrected. And when I told him the truth, he went still in the way he always has when something lands hard. He apologized twice. He didn't need to, but I understood the impulse. He's a good man. He was raised to be accountable, and that evening he was. What I couldn't have predicted was Krista, months later at that kitchen table, asking to speak with me alone, saying she'd been ashamed. I hadn't expected that. Shame is hard to sit with, and harder to say out loud, and I think it took something real in her to do it. I told her that filling in other people's stories is a very human thing to do. I meant it. I've done it myself. We all move through the world with incomplete information, and we make pictures from what we have. But the picture she'd made of me was wrong. And the thing I've come to understand, sitting with all of this, is that being misread doesn't diminish what you actually are. I knew what I had built. I knew the numbers, the properties, the accounts, the years of careful decisions made without fanfare. None of that changed because someone who didn't know assumed otherwise. What I hope Owen and Krista both carry forward, what I hope for anyone who hears a story like mine, is this: The choices you make when you think no one is watching, or when you think it doesn't matter, or when you think the other person has nothing left to offer, those choices are the ones that define you. Krista's words in that kitchen defined her for a moment. Her apology began to redefine her. That's how it works. Not through punishment, not through fate intervening dramatically, but through the accumulation of choices, each one building something or wearing something away. I carried myself with honesty through all of it. I didn't perform distress I didn't feel. I didn't pretend to a power I hadn't earned. I just knew what was true, and I waited for the right time to say it plainly. That, I think, is the only thing that held. The cast iron pan is back where it belongs. The linen tea towels are folded in the drawer. The house is quiet in the way I like it, and the June light comes through the kitchen window every morning and lands exactly where it always has. Some things you build over a lifetime. The wisest thing you can do is know what they are.